Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm delighted today to welcome Daniel Gidick as our guest on Conversing. Before going any further, I need to just confess that my knowledge of Daniel came about because he happens to be married to one of my two delightful nieces. And he and Kinsey make their home with their son Wells in Virginia. For 12 years, Daniel has taught history at the high school level. His work has been exceptional and has been the performance of his students. My conversation with him today is going to be focused on the important work of teaching history, not least at a time like this. Teaching history to high school students in the South at a time when so many debates rage about what is appropriate and inappropriate, and how does a teacher motivate and guide and inspire and lead students to engagement in one of the most important topics of any of our lives, history. Daniel, welcome. I'm just so delighted that you're here to join us on Conversing.
It's such a privilege to be here to speak with you, Mark. Thank you so much.
You know, I want to extend to you the heartiest of congratulations. As an AP history teacher at the high school level, you have just accomplished a remarkable thing, which was to lead your students through a very successful year where 47% of the students that you had in AP American history passed with a 5, which is the top score for AP history testing, and 98% passed. That is just an astounding accomplishment. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to start there just by saying how proud as a family we are, but also how grateful I am for that quality of teaching and experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very fortunate to work with some great students to build those relationships with them over the year where ultimately those scores mean a lot, not just to me, but really ultimately to them, that they can really take pride in that accomplishment. It's a year-long build-up towards that.
Well, here we are, Daniel, in this really wild moment in American history that is unfolding daily before us, where there's so much political and social drama, so much racial drama, gender drama, so much turmoil and division, so much contestation, violence and the threats of violence, so many different pieces of the turmoil of the social landscape. And at least a significant portion of it in some ways connects to history, which is a short way of saying, in my mind, that perhaps teaching American history in American high schools these days is one of the most important jobs I can think of. So I'm so grateful that you're doing it and doing it as well as you are. But right alongside that turmoil comes the moment where you have this important job to do, and therefore you have a particular purchase both on the nature of the history that is American history, on the students of this moment in high school, as they will in the fall again begin this long and arduous and extraordinary journey through AP American history. And it's all happening at the same time where on the one hand, you're causing people to look back, and on the other hand, it's all happening in the time where so many of those historic realities still have their long reach into our lives. And that puts you, to me, in a very important vortex, which is really what I want to explore. But let's begin with your personal narrative. How did history burst into your own life as you were growing up in Virginia and as you were experiencing and stepping into the narrative of history all around you, as well as whatever encouragement in your family and education was unfolding as well? How did it go?
Well, apples don't fall far from trees. And as you mentioned, being a son of Virginia, being born in Virginia, history was something I literally tripped over constantly. I grew up in an old tobacco farmhouse that my parents had restored in Chesterfield County, put a lot of time and sweat into restoring that old property. And that's kind of been a legacy I've carried on with my current residence. But gosh, from an early age, I remember trips with my parents to Williamsburg, to Monticello, to the Smithsonian's up in Washington, D.C., and to, if not all the Civil War battlefields in Virginia, a pretty good amount. Early memories of climbing up cannons at national park sites, even though I'm sure there was a sign saying "Don't climb on the cannons." But just an early engagement in those historic sites. You didn't have to look forward for them in Virginia. I've also joked too that history was a good thing for a young boy to get into early, because almost every visit to those sites in the 1980s or 90s ended in a gift shop, which is a good lure, right? You get your history lesson, but then there's a little reward in that gift shop at the end.
Yes, exactly. Some kind of memento.
That's right. So there was those early memories and experiences of Virginia history, of these trips, stood so prominent in my early childhood and adolescence. Also being the child of educators. My parents were both in elementary education, and seeing the joy they took in their profession left a strong mark upon me. Seeing the camaraderie they also had with their colleagues, the presence they had in the classroom, the school, that really didn't make a mark on me early on. There, of course, were other teachers along the way that commanded a classroom, engaged my interest, pushed us hard, that I really aspired to. I was very fortunate. I had a great experience at Midlothian High School outside of Richmond, Virginia, that compelled me to really continue to study history, which I did in a great historical setting of Charleston, South Carolina, where I attended the College of Charleston. And talk about an inspirational place to study American history there. The college campus is the city. That being able to take bike rides through Georgian and Greek Revival architecture to a city that played so prominent in the African slave trade, the ideas of nullification, where the American Civil War began, where there was an aircraft carrier from the Second World War that you were looking at. That was a great place in my 20s. That was it really fed my interest in history and education. And then after Charleston, I wanted to really juxtapose a lot of my education in the South with some time in another area that had a great sense of cultural identity, which took me to New England, where I did a master's in history at the University of Vermont for 2 years. A great experience there of seeing another area of the country. I remember great trips throughout New England or into New York. I learned to love the Hudson Highlands. Actually driving down into that area was a great Americana. Trips, of course, to Fort Ticonderoga in the Champlain Valley. That was a great experience. But yes, the connection of Virginia, Charleston, and New England really have served me well for a lot of that foundational American history, United States history.
And I think I know, but I'd love to have you comment on, as this was all unfolding, was it primarily sparked in your mind by certain people, or was it the consequence of events, or was it in other words, the movement of and transition and development with groups of people, or was it certain particular people that were leaders? I'm sure it was both, but was it a fixation on certain characters in history, or was it on groups of people in history?
The stories that come from history. That history in its nature is so much of a good storytelling, narratives that come out. Ultimately, there's stories of human conflict, human interest that are very relevant to how I was drawn to. Those are things I still try and incorporate a lot into my teaching, of relevance, of human conflict, and lessons that can be drawn from it.
Right.
Certainly there are inspirational characters along the way that stood out studying, time periods that I was really drawn to. And those have become highlighted more in my teaching.
Let's come to your teaching. So when I just think of the significance of high school teaching in general, not least having been married to a high school teacher for all these years, I'm really passionate about the significance of high school education, all of education, but high school education is, I think, probably the thing that has always secured my attention the most. And it's partly because of the depth and richness of how teachers interact with students and the significance of teachers' influence. One of the easiest ways of getting people to quickly talk, especially if they're a group of strangers, is to simply ask them to describe your favorite teacher, or describe your favorite high school teacher. And it's completely fail-proof. I mean, there's
That's great.
I've never been in a group where you don't immediately electrify the room by having them engage in such a conversation. So for you to now be such a teacher yourself, and I'm sure for various reasons that I'll ask you to explain in a moment, you've built a reputation, a fandom, a clientele, a course of experience as well as instruction. So how did you come to that profession in light of all this? And when you think about the challenge and gift of being able to be a high school history teacher, what would you imagine is most captures your own attention in the teaching task?
I want to build on the point you said about the importance of teaching high school and history at this time.
Please.
And I'm in a unique position with the students I'm fortunate enough to work with that are either taking AP, Advanced Placement United States History, for college credit, could be up to 3 or 6 hours of college credit, could be 1 or 2 classes. I also teach what's called dual enrollment courses, that they are taking these through the local community college. They're enrolled as students there. The credit they earn in my high school setting carries over. So it's a little bit more rigor. So if I do my job well and they do their job well, I'm it. I'm the last U.S. history teacher they'll have before they're taking on the greatest title that you can, other than parent, which is citizen.
Yes, yes.
That's a heavy weight. I really don't take that lightly, that if I'm it has to be thorough. It has to be good. It has to be engaging. It has to be relevant, because then they're out, they're voting, they're making decisions. They're going to pass on these stories to their children. They're hopefully going to pull over at museums, pick up a history book, or watch a documentary by hopefully Ken Burns, my favorite.
Nice.
My point is, if I'm it, I don't take that lightly, as opposed to other just generic U.S. history courses that, oh, okay, well, you'll get that later in college.
Yes.
I'm very fortunate, but also I feel a weight knowing that I could be it. I could be the last history. They'll place out. They can go on and do other great things in science or engineering or humanities.
Right.
But if I'm it for U.S. history, that's a lot to take on. And so I want it to be thorough, to be relevant and engaging for them.
Yes, that makes total sense. Now, Daniel, one of the things that I want you to describe is that you have a speech that you give at the very end of the class on the day, as I understand it, of the test, the AP test itself.
So the whole speech is a bit of a parody of Eisenhower's D-Day speech, his letter that was distributed to Allied soldiers on the eve of Operation Overlord D-Day. I've taken out tanks and planes and replaced that with study books and multiple choice questions in the DBQ.
Yes.
I've somewhat parodied that a little bit into the great words of Eisenhower as they're about to embark upon this great crusade. Today is the day of days. All of those things. It's a fun thing. The whole ritual at the end there, I call it battlefield breakfast, which began years ago where I was teaching at Wando High School in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And we would go take over the local IHOP starting at 5 a.m. before the exam. And I said, all right, everyone needs to have steak and eggs, get you a lot of protein, get you fired up for those. And I would just go around and make them feel pumped, engaged, excited about it, peppering them with questions, saying, come on now, here's some black coffee, give them a big pat on the back. It's the closest I'll ever get to like the state championship of any sports team is sending my AP kids into battle to take this exam.
Yes.
And then from after this, hyped up breakfast, they're all there. They're all with their chums, their buddies, nervous chatter going about. It's a lot of good energy there. Then we go over to everyone drives over to the high school to get ready for the exam. And in the area just in front of where the exam takes place, I give this, again, parodied speech of Eisenhower's D-Day speech to get them excited. And there's cheers and uproar and clapping that comes with it, which has been it's been warmly received and carried on. That I guess I've done that now for about maybe a dozen years. Let's call it a dozen years now.
Wow, that's great.
I've used the same piece of paper that I initially typed it out on, so it's getting wrinkled and worn. I really should rewrite it so I have it easy access on my files.
Right. Well, I love hearing that, Daniel, because part of what it pictures in my mind is a sense of a teacher that is A, deeply invested in the material, B, deeply invested in students, trying to bring the energy and vision of what this is really about with both humor, but also a seriousness that underscores not only the importance of the test in their academic development and so forth, but also really the crystallization of a process that you've engaged in with them for a whole school year. It's really a remarkable thing.
Yeah, the school year starts a good little bookend of these two. When they're walking in, I first shove into their hands these letters that are written from prior students from the year before, some that are 5 years, even 15 years old. Some of these letters are, and it's students writing to the incoming students. So here they are, they're getting a historical document right off the bat about what this is going to tell them about me, the course, what to expect. And there's humor that they put in there. Oh, look out for this or that. Oh, Gidick's known for being this way or that way. But there's always a lot of the positive. He demands a lot of you. He expects a lot of you because he knows you can do it. Don't be intimidated. Don't give up. Don't drop the class. It's a lot of really positive things they say. And so having that bookended with the DJ speech after battlefield breakfast and that's the thing we last do on the last day. I'm sorry, before they go away for summer, that's their last assignment is to write a letter to the next class. So I've built up this nice reservoir of letters.
Yes,
that
absolutely
goes on to the next generation. It's better than just name icebreakers. It's better than name game icebreakers on day one.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's great. So, Daniel, when you're teaching American history, and I know you have to do it within the framework of the educational standards of the state of Virginia, and that you are happy, I believe, to do that, which not every teacher is happy to do, but I'm glad that is. Why do you think that the Virginia educational standards for you are a good and helpful framework for what you want to do as a teacher?
I think that they help provide a decent narrative and flow. I actually find that there is a fair amount of latitude within the language that is chosen and laid out. I know there's been a lot of controversy about those. It's a very good example of the politicalization of high school history. You don't have to look very far to see numerous news articles about Virginia history standards and issues that we're taking with them. But in the drafts that I have seen and gone through, I understand where certain things are chosen. And I would also say that document that's produced has not limited my course content. I have not felt constrained or limited. It provides a lot of latitude to bring multiple voices to the table, to not look up to individuals as marble gods, nor as Satan's henchmen, but as humans.
Right.
In the end, they are that. There's a good quote I always love from John Meacham.
One of the great American historians, still
true,
alive and writing.
And that we learn the most from those who came before us, not by gazing up at them uncritically or down on them condescendingly, but by looking them in the eye and taking their true measure as human beings, not as gods.
It's a great quote. Daniel, does the role of standards then, are you saying, create a kind of minimum but not maximum amount of content? Is that one way, or is that the wrong way of describing it?
I would see it as that. I would see it as a minimum as opposed to a maximum. There are countless things I go well beyond in discussions. And the same is true with the AP standards that I use, the AP course exam description. Their standards are not limiting, but a minimum. And so you're able to draw a lot of examples. So I have not at all felt really constrained by any of the standards. I understand they're very important, that certainly multiple groups need to be heard. Teachers, parents, other community leaders certainly all need to be able to weigh in on public state standards. But I have not found them to be any sort of limitation on what I'm able to teach, what's either included or left out.
And do you feel the pressure of activist parents in any particular way upon your teaching?
No, is my thought out answer on that. I have not really felt on that because I try to avoid any language that could be very accusatory or defaming.
Yes.
Another thing I try and push upon students is that we need to look at history going forward, not from the condescension of the present looking back. How will we be judged? These students say that you knowingly use these plastic straws that are so, you all know they're so bad for the environment, yet you're all using them. You all know, no one here is in favor of slavery, yet we have clothes or iPhones that are made in conditions that we would equate to slavery.
Right.
So I try to look moving forward often. I try and look at history looking forward, not looking back. Certainly there's always, parents, it's more involvement into this or that issue with a student per se, of generally an assignment deadline or lack thereof deadline.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. Tell us what your burden is. You begin the school year, and I know that we've talked before about the fact that it's sort of off to the races because you have so much material to cover in what is really a relatively brief period of time. But when you enter the class and you're thinking of what is most important, like what is this whole experience going to amount to, and what do I most want students to understand? Here I'm speaking specifically of content. Maybe name the 2 or 3 pieces of the content of that experience that you would say, yeah, it particularly matters to me that this content or these events, these people, et cetera, have really made their place.
So I think the 2 critical events in U.S. history, the 2 pivot points are, of course, one, the American Civil War. No surprise on that. The whole first half of the year leads up to that, looking at different colonial regions, then debates over the issue of constitution, of state versus national power, and central always to that is slavery. It's been this, joke isn't the right word, but I always say, to my students, when in doubt, the answer of a division in U.S. history is slavery. It's something we constantly come back to, that we talk about. It's this massive lead up to this issue of state power becoming subordinate to national, of industry over agriculture, of free labor over enslaved labor, and the ramifications of such. That obviously is just point one. So the events leading up to this and throughout the Civil War, hands down, it is a central issue. And Reconstruction, Civil War and Reconstruction, the unfulfilled promise of Reconstruction. Then the second most important event that I like to really get with students and stress upon them is, and this might be a surprise to some, but is the New Deal. Because the New Deal is the pivot point. Let me go for the 20th century. It redefines the word government, is the way I tell students. Before the New Deal, if I was saying government, we meant you can't fight City Hall. We meant county or state government. The only way I interacted with my federal government was when I went down to the post office. Now, countlessly, I'm interacting with my federal government through degrees of regulation, protections, and freedoms, and taxation. Constantly interacting with our federal government. The New Deal is that. And what we're always going to be debating from that point on is the New Deal, whether we're talking Great Society or COVID stimulus or anger against we're debating the New Deal.
Right.
So that is another one that I really press hard with my students. Before this, we also see there's this pendulum in U.S. history, say from the Gilded Age, a lack of regulation, then to the Progressive Era where there is a more active leadership from a federal government, then to the 1920s, and of course then up to the New Deal, which carries on arguably well into the 50s elements of it. And then we start to see a swinging back away, certainly in the post-Great Society times and the Reagan Revolution. And I tell students that when you can begin to identify that pendulum and where it's going, then you'll find clarity.
Right. Those 2 things do strike me as the 2 most important. That's interesting. Certainly Civil War, I would have guessed. I wouldn't have named the New Deal in the way you did, but for the reasons that I immediately understand, it is the right second thing to name.
I mean, if I say the word government to you, you instantly think, or anyone, you think national government. Well, the government this. It's just assumed that. Before the New Deal, it was state or local. After, it's just national. And there's a lot of pros to that, but then of course there are arguments of cons, and that pendulum swings. We're always debating the New Deal in our politics. always debating it.
So along the way, when students, especially of this generation, are studying more deeply than they would have ever done otherwise, these significant events and people in the American story, what do you find students grapple with the hardest, or that is the most difficult or challenging for them to actually come to terms with, do you think?
I would say a skill of contextualization, again, bringing what we're talking about into the moment it was happening as opposed to applying just present hindsight to it. So contextualization is a very important, bring context to, well, what's going on? How did this arrive there? That's a skill I push for them. And then another one they struggle with is making an argument in thesis writing. And I know that might surprise,
Right.
Oh, you would expect AP students and early college students, dual enrollment students to have that in the bag. And I've found that they're still struggling with that. So I've worked very hard with them to grow in those fields through a couple of ways. One, for my little thesis formula, which I joke is my patent pending, but is this idea of while X, ultimately Y and Z. I do want them to see that there are multiple ways that you could take a question, an open-ended question. Well, and when you are setting up argumentative writing, an argument isn't just yelling louder.
Yes.
It's not just showing your side. If you and I have a disagreement, I need to build trust with you. I need to show that I understand what you're saying. And that, of course, is the X. While you were making that point, ultimately, I bring in evidence in categories Y and Z that will outweigh that. By, again, by discussing X, build credibility, can show complexity. That's a big skill there. Another tool that I've used, it's a series that's out there I've really liked. It's called Taking Sides. And it's where different historians have written articles that deal with a number of different issues, debated issues in American history. And one kind of takes a yes argument to the question. Another one takes a no, where the assignment is that they're able to choose each semester, choose which question that they're most interested in. And I provide the articles for them. They kind of read through them. The assignment is to provide a little context initially, then surmise Article 1, and then surmise Article 2, but then ultimately come to your own conclusions. Where do you see it? Where do you see the strength of this historian versus that historian and their argument? What evidence is good? Where do you kind of come to your conclusion? And hopefully, in the end, it's a little bit of column A, it's a little bit of column B, but they do make their own conclusion in the end. Taking Sides is the series, and I've been very fortunate to use that over the years.
So I'm curious, because the similar thing I would think is going on in some of the students' minds as they weigh what they're learning in your class with whatever the narration of their family has been about some of the same events, right? Not that all of the events that you're teaching in American history would be ones that the family would have discussed, but there certainly are plenty that would. And I'm just curious, do students find a tension, a kind of individuation process going on where I grew up in a home where ... was thought to be true, but now I'm realizing I have to grapple with a different set of facts or perspectives?
Well, I hope I've challenged them on that. If they're just hearing more of the same, then I don't think that's a really productive class. I hope I'm challenging them on different concepts that are being presented.
Right.
Maybe it's a different story. And of course, as a teacher, so maybe you have to take a devil's advocate side to explain the rationale behind Andrew Jackson's policies. And it was incredibly popular, yet today we can look back at his policies on a bank and Native American removal as monstrosities or poorly executed, yet at the time were seen as a right and popular way. So sometimes I have to kind of present that. One story though that I've been very fortunate to engage with a number of students on is something that is very shared in a lot of American households in our lineage, is that of the story of immigration, of students that their parents or they themselves were immigrants. I've from Europe, Latin America, Asia, that I've had students that have immigrated from different points of the world. And that's just a constant theme in U.S. history, right? Migration, immigration. I've really enjoyed lessons and times where we engage into that. And also with what comes with immigration, the story of nativism. Those have been some engaging lessons that I think that all students are able to relate to because there's some degree of a immigration migration story in family backgrounds.
Right. Speaking of that, I did wonder, how much does ethnicity and ethnic background affect how students interact in the class and or engage in American history when they may be outsiders to it, that is, immigrants that have come into to the country, or disassociated from it in a certain way that they haven't really understood before? How does that play in this? Because that's often part of this so-called culture wars, and I'm just curious how it lands in a classroom like yours.
Honestly, a lot of stuff that we talk about, it really is the first time that they're hearing this story about the know-nothings of the 1850s, or it's the first time they're hearing about a Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s,
right? Or
it's the first time they're hearing about that actually, women did have the right to vote before the 19th Amendment in different states. So Janet Rankin was a member of Congress before the 19th Amendment passed. So a lot of it really is just some exposure for the first time. But how does it come in with ethnicity? I would say that certainly some students are really piqued by the experience of immigration. I can think back to some students who their parents migrated to the United States. That topic really spoke to them. They wrote some very compelling papers upon that topic. Others are very eager to engage in gender issues when we get to the later civil rights movement of the 1960s. Others are really interested in technology because they're STEM kids, and they're able to really pique their interest on Edison. One thing that kids, I really like this. I've had a couple of good students write some papers and do some studies on the rise and decline of American rail traffic. They're really interested in transportation. I had another student who was so into, automobile of Ford and the growth of so I allow a lot to pique their interest. I know that doesn't really address what you were saying there necessarily on ethnicity, but when a student has a good interest in a subject, I allow that to run, and I continually coach along, help provide guidance and facilitate their interests.
Yes, exactly. So as students culminate in this class, I would imagine the journey is a very visceral and exhausting one for many students because it's such a demanding course. But at the same time, what would you say the arc is? What do you find students feel about America or about the United States is what I'm talking about. How do students feel about the United States once they've begun to grasp enough of this narrative that they can actually hold on to it all in some measure? Where do they go psychologically, emotionally, with what that has meant to them or what to make of it as a reality in the world?
Well, I think maybe the first part of your question is the arc that you mentioned. And initially, I think they come in often saying, oh, I remember this. I learned about colonial history. I have a general understanding of U.S. history. And so they initially come in quite confident about United States history. And that stays for a bit, but as we get into really as the rubber hits the road, as we get into presidential administrations, the debate of Hamilton and Jefferson, into the market revolution, that's when they start saying, oh, wow, this is a lot deeper. There's a lot more, there's a lot of degrees of complicity here. As we get into the issue of slavery, defenses of slavery, the expansion of slavery, then they start to really, there's a lot of eye-opening at that. There's a lovely cycle as we pass over the mid-year. The clock, of course, is always ticking in history. We have to push forward. There's the old saying that Lincoln has to be dead by Christmas. And sometimes Fort Sumter's only been fired upon by Christmas, or Lincoln's only elected by Christmas, and that's not good. We've got to go. There's an ebb always when we get to the Gilded Age a bit. Although that I've seen a little bit of increase of interest in that because that we're able to compare our Carnegie, our Vanderbilt, our Morgans to a lot of contemporary individuals of Bezos and Musk and others. I try and bring those there. So there's been a bit more pickup of interest there. But where do they come in their conclusions of U.S. history? I don't know. I have to be really honest and give you a disappointing answer. I would like them to be able to see a lot of the positive natures, a lot of the promises that the United States has yet to live up to. But I hope that they feel a degree of positive nature, that there is a ongoing struggle. When we get to a critical issue in the American Revolution, we look at, say, the Declaration of Independence. I ask them, well, when does the revolution end? Does it end with Yorktown? No. Does it end with creation of a constitution? No. When does it end? It doesn't. The ideas that Jefferson calls upon us to aspire to, challenges us with, we're always going to be striving to work towards those. Those ideas that are put forth are passed on from one generation to the next. They're the students I teach, they're the next inheritors of the challenge of the revolution. The revolution doesn't end. It'll be up to them to take the ideals of what a government is meant to do, what are the roles and responsibilities of citizenship, what do these mean in their time, and apply it to their world.
Yes.
So I hope maybe to answer your question, that they feel a degree of connection with the past, to find relevance with the past, and to feel also a challenge to be able to continue the work of earlier generations.
Right, right. When I was in high school, there was a class that used to be taught called civics. And it was really about this convergence of sort of history, politics, sociology, how to government, how do all these things converge for the sake of being a citizen, as you said earlier. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, is that part of the experience of AP, or does that feel beyond the limits of what an AP history course is really trying to do?
I often said to my AP government teachers that I've set them up for you. It's a good batch that's coming up.
Yes.
So I feel that the courses I teach are very strong primers for taking AP Gov, as we call it, or dual enrollment government, that they really can now have so many examples, prior experiences, prior knowledge to back up their claims, to bring in the evidence, right? A statement without evidence is meaningless. If you don't have that evidence, then what are we giving here? That history in my time with them is all about where's the evidence to bring in your claim to back that up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that it's really carried on from my class into the next. Yeah. I hope.
Yeah, that's very encouraging, actually, because obviously the sequence needs to keep going on. Just as in that sense, the American Revolution continues on, so does the growth of continued knowledge and understanding based on facts need to continue on. I'm curious, what do you think is your view of historiography? Meaning, what's your theory of history that can help guide and shape a citizen or a potential listener to have a sense of why history matters and why it needs to be fact-based at a time when it often seems that it's not in any way fact-based. It's all just about whoever has the loudest or most influential microphone. And yet you're saying, actually, no, the facts of history really matter, not just the narrator and not just the posture of power.
For sure. Well stated there. As they're being set up to become, as I said, the most important role they'll take on, title they'll become on, is that of citizenship.
Yes.
Other than a parent, that's the most important title one can take on. To be active, to be engaged, to be informed. It starts with I just believe, of course, I'm incredibly biased to this, but it starts with historical knowledge and education. To be able to appreciate, to want to preserve elements of the historical landscape is part of that. To be able to, want to read into these time periods further, to further one's education. I said earlier that if things go well with my class, that I'm it, right? I'm the last stop for U.S. history. I really hope I'm not. Right. I really hope that.
Yes.
And I hear from some that, they've gone on, taken other courses, and they really look back at that. This was a great experience that set me up to take other classes. They've gone on to law school now. That they remember when I was stressing the importance of Marbury versus Madison or McCulloch v. Maryland and John Marshall.
Right.
That my enthusiasm for those, they can recall that years on.
So if a student graduates and obviously passes with not least with a 5 in the case of 47% of your past year's students, and they go out to be citizens, to take up this role that you've understandably said is the second most important role to being a parent, how will their citizenship be affected by the course that you've instructed them in?
Powerful question. I hope that they feel a connection to the past, that they are capable of taking up the challenges of the present as countless other individuals have. Hopefully they can find strength from challenges of the reform and abolitionist movements, or the suffrage movement, or the civil rights movement, or any other, or the toil and labor of labor unions and Sam Gompers and the AFL or whatever. They can find some strength in those earlier examples. That's where I really hope that they can find strength and reassurance that whatever challenges they will face, they stand on good shoulders.
I think that's a tremendous vision. I certainly hope that's true, Daniel.
Or they'll be really good at trivia. They'll be really good at bar trivia. I don't know. Like, that's a thing. They'll remember that, and then they'll get a good bar tab at some place eventually. I don't know. Maybe it's just that, right?
Right. I do hear you. I mean, no teacher ever gets to control the trajectory of what we've tried to provide for our students. But
right.
I just want to say again, Daniel, I've loved the fact that you have the grandfather clock pinging in the background. Father Time is alive and well in your house, and you are helping people to face the realities of Father Time in the past and the present for the sake of the future. So
it's always there. It's always there.
Yeah.
It pushes us forward whether we want it to be or not.
Indeed. It relentlessly pushes us forward. You know, I'm aware that when I go from California, where I live, to Virginia, that I'm transported into a different presence and visibility of history in a way that you're not when you're in California. California has a lot of historical places, sites, buildings, events have happened in California. But when I go to Virginia, I'm aware that I'm in a different place with a different tangibility of American history than the tangibility of the American history that I see in California. And I just think of the gift that it is to live in that area and to be aware, as you did so as a child and have now continued to do through your professional life, this embrace of context and of the great drama that has been unfolding, really, in your case, immediately around where you live right now and will presumably for the future. So it's a beautiful picture of your life, and that you've given yourself to this really important work, because as we all know right now, we're in this period, this inflection period in American history, which is problematic and fraught and divided and hostile in so many different ways. Fearful. And in the meantime, you are trying to ground people in the reality of what has happened in the past with all of its own inherent challenges, as well as its great inspirations. So, Daniel, thank you for your civic contribution and for your personal contribution to the students.
It's a real privilege. I want to throw in one thing that you were saying here about this time.
Please.
On the back of my door, so as soon as come in, the doors are closed. The whole door is lined with quotes by countless different Americans. I probably have 40 different up there, all cut and pasted on a nice little collage, right? And one of my favorite quotes is FDR. And of course, the only thing to fear is fear itself. But actually, there's another line that I really take more to heart. Is this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and prosper. The optimism that he has and his call to action. That's what gets a lot of applause in his inaugural address there. That we must avoid fear. As Jefferson said, keep fear always at the stern and hope at our bow. The nation will endure, it will revive and prosper if we take action. For, again, as Meacham says, one of the points of reflecting on the past is to prepare us for action in the present.
Yes.
One of the key points of reflecting on the past is to prepare us for action in the present. And I hope that my course encourages my students to do that.
I'm sure it does, Daniel. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
It was a great honor. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.